Jake had a problem. Actually, he had many problems. But the biggest one was that he could never say what he really meant. At 32 years old, he'd gotten used to people looking confused when he talked. His friends would nod politely, then do completely different things than what he thought he'd asked for. His coworkers would send him puzzled emails asking for clarification. Even the pizza delivery guy once showed up at his neighbor's house because Jake's directions were so mixed up. But Jake never thought his confusing way of talking would turn his life upside down. Not until he inherited his grandmother's old house. The house was beautiful, really, built in 1920. It had tall ceilings, fancy woodwork, and windows that let in golden morning light. But it also had problems, big problems. The wallpaper was peeling off the walls like old skin. The floors creaked so loudly that walking to the bathroom at night sounded like a horror movie. The kitchen faucet dripped constantly, playing a never-ending song that drove Jake crazy. His grandmother had been what people politely called a collector. What they really meant was that she kept everything. Every room was packed with stuff. Tiny ceramic animals covered every surface. Old magazines were stacked in corners. Broken appliances filled the basement, waiting for repairs that never came. Jake knew he needed help. He couldn't fix this mess alone. So he did what any normal person would do. He looked online for someone to help renovate the house. That's when he found Lisa. Lisa's website showed beautiful before and after photos of old houses transformed into dream homes. Her reviews were amazing. Lisa saved our house, wrote one customer. She understood exactly what we wanted, said another. Best contractor we've ever worked with. Jake called her immediately. When Lisa arrived at the house the next Tuesday morning, Jake felt hopeful for the first time in weeks. She was professional, carrying a tablet and measuring tape. She wore work boots and had paint under her fingernails, the sign of someone who actually did the work herself. So, tell me about your vision for this place, Lisa said, pulling out her tablet to take notes. Jake walked her through the house, pointing out problems as they went. In the living room, he gestured at the dozens of ceramic cats sitting on every windowsill, bookshelf, and side table. His grandmother had loved cats, but she'd gone a bit overboard. There were cats wearing tiny hats, cats holding miniature fishing poles, cats dressed like famous people from history. These cats, Jake said, waving his hand round the room. I mean, they're everywhere. It's just, stop, just stop with all these cats everywhere. Lisa nodded and made notes on her tablet. But what Jake didn't know was that Lisa had just finished working with Mr. Peterson, an elderly man who had driven her nearly crazy for 3 months. Mr. Peterson would say things like, "I hate this blue paint," when he actually loved it. Or, "Don't put any plants in here," when he wanted a garden room. Lisa had learned to listen for what clients really meant, not what they actually said. When Jake said stop with all these cats everywhere, Lisa heard something different. She heard a man who was overwhelmed but didn't want to hurt his grandmother's memory by getting rid of everything. She thought he wanted her to organize the cats better. Maybe create a special display area where they could be properly shown off. "I understand completely," Lisa said. "We'll create a beautiful cat display area. Maybe some custom shelving where each piece can really shine." Jake blinked. "Wait, what?" But Lisa was already measuring the wall space, muttering about lighting and display cases. She was excited about the project. In her mind, she was helping Jake honor his grandmother's memory while making the collection look intentional. Instead of cluttered, they moved to the kitchen, where Jake's grandmother had kept broken appliances from decades past. A mixer from the 1950s sat on the counter, its cord frayed and motor dead. A heart-shaped waffle iron hadn't worked since the Carter administration. A toaster that only toasted one side of bread was somehow still plugged in. "All this old stuff that doesn't work," Jake said, shaking his head. "I mean, stop keeping all this broken junk, right?" Again, Lisa heard something different. She saw vintage appliances that could be restored to working condition. She imagined how amazing the kitchen would look with properly functioning retro equipment. It would be like stepping back in time, but with everything actually working. "These are incredible pieces," Lisa said, examining the heart-shaped waffle iron. With some restoration work, this kitchen could be absolutely stunning. Like a working museum of vintage appliances, Jake felt a familiar sinking feeling in his stomach. This was the same feeling he'd had in college when he'd asked his roommate to stop playing music so loud and the guy had bought better speakers, or when he told his sister to stop buying him sweaters for Christmas, and she'd started knitting them herself. But Lisa seemed so enthusiastic, and her reviews had been so good. Maybe she knew something he didn't. Maybe this would all work out somehow. They finished the tour in the bathroom, where Jake's grandmother had installed wallpaper covered in tiny dancing lobsters. As a kid, Jake had nightmares about those lobsters. They seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. This wallpaper, Jake said, staring at the dancing crustaceans. It needs to go. I mean, stop with the dancing lobster thing. Lisa smiled and made more notes in her mind. She was already planning how to honor the whimsical spirit of the original design, while making it more sophisticated. Maybe a custom mural by a local artist. Something that captured the playful energy, but with better execution. As Lisa packed up her measuring tools and prepared to leave, Jake felt both hopeful and nervous. She seemed to understand what he wanted, but something felt off. He couldn't put his finger on what it was. I'll have some initial designs ready by Friday, Lisa said, shaking his hand. This is going to be such a fun project. Your grandmother had wonderful taste. We're just going to help it shine. After she left, Jake stood in his living room, surrounded by ceramic cats and broken appliances. He had the strangest feeling that he'd just set something in motion that he couldn't control. But Lisa was a professional. She had great reviews. What could possibly go wrong? He picked up one of the cats, a small tabby wearing a tiny crown, and examined it closely. Maybe his grandmother's collection wasn't so bad after all. Maybe Lisa was right, and they just needed to be displayed properly. Jake had no idea that he'd just hired someone who was very, very good at reading between the lines. Unfortunately, Jake didn't have any lines to read between. He just had scattered thoughts that sometimes connected to form half-finished ideas. The renovation was about to begin, and neither Jake nor Lisa realized they were speaking completely different languages. 3 days later, Jake got a phone call that changed everything. Great news. Lisa's voice was bubbling with excitement through the phone. I found the most amazing collection of vintage cats at an estate sale. There are 36 of them, and they're perfect for your display wall. Jake nearly dropped his coffee mug. Wait, what display wall? The one we talked about for your grandmother's cat collection. I've also contacted a carpenter who specializes in custom shelving. He can build floor-to-ceiling display cases with individual lighting for each piece. It's going to look like a professional museum exhibit. Jake's mind went blank. He stood in his kitchen, staring at the broken toaster, trying to process what Lisa had just said. But I said stop with the cats. I meant get rid of them. Oh, I know you're excited, Lisa said. I could tell by your voice that you really love them, but felt overwhelmed by how they were displayed. Don't worry, we're going to make them shine. After Lisa hung up, Jake sat down heavily in his grandmother's old rocking chair. A ceramic cat dressed like a tiny pirate stared at him from the coffee table. Jake stared back. This is not what I meant, he said to the pirate cat. The cat, of course, didn't answer. 2 days later, boxes started arriving. Big boxes, small boxes. Boxes wrapped in bubble wrap and marked fragile in red letters. Jake opened the first one and found a cat wearing a miniature wedding dress, complete with a tiny veil and bouquet. The second box contained a cat dressed as a ship captain, holding a telescope no bigger than a pencil dot by noon. Jake's living room looked like a cat convention had exploded. There were cats everywhere, on the floor, on the couch, covering every surface. Some wore tiny uniforms, others held miniature musical instruments. One particularly fancy cat was dressed as a queen, complete with a gold crown and royal robe. Jake called Lisa. The cats are here, he said, trying to keep his voice calm. Wonderful. Did you see the Napoleon cat? I'm particularly proud of that find. He's wearing an authentic reproduction of a French military uniform from 1805. Jake looked around his living room. Sure enough, there was a small orange cat wearing a blue jacket with gold buttons and a tiny hat. The cat looked surprisingly dignified. For something made of ceramic, Lisa, Jake said slowly, when I said stop with the cats, I meant remove them. Take them away. No more cats. Oh, you're worried about space. Don't be. The carpenter will be there Monday to start building the display cases. We'll have room for everything, plus space for future additions. Jake felt that familiar sinking feeling again, but stronger this time. It was like being on a roller coaster that was climbing higher and higher, and he couldn't get off. Monday morning arrived with the sound of power tools. Jake woke up to drilling and hammering coming from his living room. He stumbled downstairs, in his pajamas, to find a cheerful man in overalls measuring his walls. You must be Jake. The carpenter said, I'm Tom. Lisa told me all about your grandmother's amazing collection. This is going to be quite a display. Tom showed Jake the plans. The entire living room wall would be covered with custom shelving. Each shelf would have its own light. There would be small brass nameplates for each cat. The whole thing looked like something you'd see in an expensive art gallery. This seems like a lot, Jake said weakly. Oh, it is, Tom agreed happily. But Lisa said you wanted something really special to honor your grandmother's memory. She's right. These aren't just cats. They're works of art. Jake picked up the Napoleon cat and studied its tiny painted face. The detail was actually incredible. Someone had spent hours painting whiskers finer than human hair and eyes. That seemed almost alive. Maybe this wasn't so bad. Maybe Lisa was right, and he just needed to see the collection properly displayed. That hope lasted exactly 48 hours. Wednesday morning, Jake answered his door to find a delivery truck parked outside. The driver was unloading even more boxes. More cats? Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. Special order, the driver said, something about historical figures. Jake opened the boxes with growing horror. There was a cat dressed as Benjamin Franklin, complete with tiny glasses and a quill pen. A cat wearing Shakespeare's rough collar held a miniature scroll. Another cat was dressed as Einstein, with wild white fur and a tiny chalkboard covered in mathematical equations. His phone rang. It was Lisa. Did the historical collection arrive? She asked. I thought you loved the educational aspect. Each cat represents a different period in history. It's like having a history lesson right in your living room. Jake sat down on his couch, surrounded by boxes of historical cats. The Einstein cat seemed to be judging him with its painted eyes. Lisa, Jake said, I need to be very clear about something. When I say stop, I mean stop. Not more, not better. Just stop. I can hear the emotion in your voice, Lisa said warmly. You're overwhelmed by how perfect this is turning out. I completely understand. It's a big change from just having them scattered around randomly. After she hung up, Jake looked around his living room. Tom the carpenter was installing tiny spotlights for each shelf. The Napoleon cat sat on the coffee table like a general surveying his troops. The Einstein cat was somehow balanced on a stack of books, as if it had been reading. Jake's neighbor, Mrs. Chen, knocked on the door around lunchtime. She was carrying a casserole and wearing a concerned expression. I saw all the delivery trucks, she said, peering past Jake into the living room. Are you okay? It looks like you're opening a cat museum. I'm not sure what I'm opening, Jake said honestly. Mrs. Chen stepped inside and stopped short. Oh my, that's a lot of cats. 68, to be exact, Jake said. And Lisa says she's not done yet. Mrs. Chen studied the Napoleon cat with scientific interest. You know, this is actually quite well made. Look at the detail on the uniform buttons. Jake realized she was right. Each cat wasn't just a cheap souvenir. They were carefully crafted pieces, each one unique and detailed. The problem wasn't that they were bad. The problem was that there were so many of them, maybe. Mrs. Chen said thoughtfully, you just need to figure out which ones you actually like. That evening, Jake sat in his living room as Tom finished installing the last of the display lights. The room was transformed. What had been cluttered chaos was now an organized exhibition. Each cat had its own space, its own light, its own little brass nameplate. Jake had to admit it looked impressive, professional, even, like something you'd pay admission to see. But it still wasn't what he'd wanted. He wanted fewer cats, not a cat museum. He wanted simple, not spectacular. His phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "Wait until you see what I have planned for the kitchen. The vintage appliance restoration specialist is so excited to work on those pieces." Jake closed his eyes and counted to 10. Then he counted to 20. The Napoleon cat watched him from its place of honor on the center shelf, looking smug in its tiny military uniform. This was just the beginning, and Jake was starting to realize that his communication problem was about to get much, much worse. Jake thought the cat situation was bad. He had no idea what was coming next. Monday morning started with the sound of someone singing in his kitchen. Not just humming, actual singing, like they were performing on stage. Jake stumbled downstairs, still half asleep, to find a stranger in coveralls taking apart his grandmother's old mixer. "Good morning," the man called out cheerfully. "I'm Dave, the vintage appliance specialist. Lisa hired me to bring these beautiful machines back to life." Jake watched in fascination as Dave carefully cleaned decades of dust from the mixer's chrome surface. Under all that grime was a gorgeous machine that looked like it belonged in a fancy restaurant. "This is a 1950 to KitchenAid Model K5, Dave explained, his voice full of reverence. "They don't make them like this anymore. Once I replace the motor and rewire it, this thing will outlast any modern mixer by 20 years. Jake had to admit it. Looked pretty cool. But that wasn't the point, Dave, Jake said carefully. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I told Lisa to get rid of the old appliances, not fix them." Dave looked confused. "But Lisa said you wanted to honor your grandmother's memory by restoring her kitchen to its original glory. She said you were excited about having authentic vintage appliances that actually worked." Jake closed his eyes and counted to 10. Then he counted to 20. When he opened them, Dave was holding up the heart-shaped waffle iron, polishing it, like it was made of gold. "Now this," Dave said with a grin, "this is special. Heart-shaped waffles went out of style in the 1960s, but they're making a comeback. Food bloggers are going crazy for vintage breakfast equipment." By the time Dave left that evening, Jake's kitchen looked like a museum exhibit called American Breakfast, 1950 to 1980. The mixer gleamed on the counter like a chrome sculpture. The waffle iron had been restored to perfect working condition, complete with the original recipe book. Even the one-sided toaster had been fixed and now toasted both sides evenly. Jake had to admit it was impressive. Everything worked perfectly, and the kitchen had a warm, nostalgic feeling that made him want to cook breakfast for a crowd. But it still wasn't what he'd asked for. That night, Lisa called to check on the progress. "Dave says the kitchen is amazing," she said happily. "He's never seen such a complete collection of vintage breakfast equipment. You're going to love making Sunday morning waffles, Lisa," Jake said, trying to sound calm. "This is getting out of hand. I asked you to stop keeping the old stuff. I meant throw it away, not restore it to museum quality." "Oh, I can hear how emotional you are," Lisa said warmly. "It must be overwhelming to see your grandmother's things looking so beautiful again. Dave said you nearly cried when you saw the mixer working." Jake hadn't nearly cried. He'd been speechless with shock, but trying to explain that seemed pointless. "What's next?" Jake asked, afraid to hear the answer. "The bathroom," Lisa said excitedly. "I've been saving the best for last. I found the most amazing artist who specializes in whimsical murals. She's going to transform those dancing lobsters into something absolutely magical." Jake's blood ran cold. He'd almost forgotten about the lobster wallpaper, the stuff of his childhood nightmares. "Lisa, please," Jake said desperately. "Just remove the lobster wallpaper. Paint the walls white. Simple white walls. Trust me," Lisa said. "When you see what Rachel can do with those lobsters, you're going to be amazed." 3 days later, Jake came home from work to find a woman in paint splattered over all standing in his bathroom, studying the lobster wallpaper with the intensity of an art critic. "You must be Jake," she said. Wiping paint from her hands, "I'm Rachel," Lisa told me. "All about your vision for this space." "My vision?" Jake asked weakly. "The dancing lobster theme, but elevated, more sophisticated. Less kitschy, more artistic." Rachel gestured at the wall like she was conducting an orchestra. "I'm thinking life-size lobsters, but painted in a classical style, like they're performing ballet at the Metropolitan Opera." Jake felt dizzy. "Life-sized lobsters. Don't worry," Rachel said, mistaking his horror for excitement. "They won't be scary. They'll be elegant, graceful, like underwater dancers." Over the next week, Jake watched his bathroom transform into something from a fever dream. Rachel painted enormous lobsters across every surface, the walls, the ceiling, even the back of the door. But these weren't the cute cartoon lobsters from the original wallpaper. These were realistic, detailed lobsters that seemed to move when Jake wasn't looking directly at them. The lobster on the ceiling wore a tiny crown and appeared to be conducting the others with a miniature baton. The ones on the walls were posed in various ballet positions, their claws extended gracefully. The shower curtain featured synchronized swimming lobsters performing elaborate underwater routines. Jake's childhood nightmares had nothing on this. His brother Tony came to visit that weekend and stopped dead in the bathroom doorway. "Dude," Tony said slowly, "what happened in here?" "I told Lisa to stop with the dancing lobsters," Jake said miserably. Tony studied the ceiling lobster, which seemed to be looking back at him, and she made them bigger, much bigger, and added more of them, so many more. Tony was quiet for a long moment. He said finally, "It's actually kind of impressive, in a completely terrifying way." That evening, Lisa called for her usual progress check. "Rachel says the bathroom is her masterpiece," Lisa said proudly. "She's never been so inspired by a client's vision before. The way you described wanting the lobsters to stop dancing really sparked her creativity. Now they're not just dancing, they're performing." Jake sat in his living room, surrounded by 68 ceramic cats, listening to his vintage mixer hum in the kitchen, while life-sized lobsters watched him from the bathroom. Somewhere along the way, his simple home renovation had turned into the world's most elaborate misunderstanding. "Lisa," Jake said quietly, "I think we need to talk." "Of course," Lisa said brightly. "I've been thinking the same thing. We need to discuss the final touches. I have some ideas about coordinating themes throughout the house. Maybe some lobster-themed cat accessories, or some cat-shaped kitchen timers to tie everything together." Jake hung up the phone and looked at the Napoleon cat, who seemed to be smirking from his place of honor on the center shelf. "This is all your fault," Jake told the cat. The Napoleon cat continued smirking, completely unrepentant about the chaos he'd helped create. What happened next surprised everyone, especially Jake. Instead of spending the day arguing about who was wrong, they started playing a game that Amy called Keep or Go. "Okay," Lisa said, pulling out her tablet to take notes. "Let's go through everything piece by piece. Jake, I'm going to ask you yes or no questions. No long explanations. No trailing off mid-sentence. Just yes or no." They started with the cats. Lisa picked up each one individually. "Napoleon cat?" Jake looked at the small orange cat in its tiny military uniform. After 3 weeks of living with it, he'd grown oddly attached to the little guy. "Keep." "George Washington cat." "Go." "Einstein cat." Jake studied the wild-haired feline with its miniature chalkboard. "Keep." "Pirate cat." "Keep." It took an hour to go through all 68 cats. When they were done, Jake had chosen to keep 12 of them, the ones with the most personality and the best craftsmanship. The rest would go to a local antique shop where Lisa was sure they'd find loving homes. "Now the kitchen," Amy said, leading them to the vintage appliances. The heart-shaped waffle iron was an easy decision. Jake had made waffles 3 times that week, and they were the best he'd ever tasted. "Keep." The restored mixer was harder. It was beautiful and worked perfectly. But Jake wasn't much of a baker. "Go. But maybe help me find someone who would really appreciate it." Lisa nodded, making notes. "I know a bakery downtown that collects vintage equipment. They love it." The one-sided toaster that now toasted both sides had become Jake's favorite appliance. Definitely keep. By the time they finished the kitchen, Jake realized something interesting. Some of Lisa's mistakes had actually improved his life. The working vintage appliances had inspired him to cook more. He made homemade waffles for his neighbors twice. Mrs. Chen had started coming over for coffee just to see the heart-shaped waffle iron in action. The bathroom was the biggest challenge. The life-size ballet dancing lobsters covered every surface. They couldn't exactly remove half a mural. This is the hardest one, Jake admitted. Standing in the doorway, I still have nightmares about these lobsters, but I have to admit them. Artwork is incredible. Rachel had painted each lobster with museum-quality detail. Their expressions were both graceful and slightly mischievous. The ceiling lobster with its conductor's baton seemed to be orchestrating an underwater symphony. What if we compromise? Lisa suggested. What if Rachel could paint over some of them? Maybe keep just one wall instead of the whole room. Jake thought about it. One wall of artistic lobsters might actually be a great conversation starter. The full-room lobster ballet was overwhelming, but a single accent wall could be interesting. One wall, he decided, the far wall, and maybe tone down the ceiling lobster. I'll call Rachel. Lisa said she'll probably be relieved. She told me yesterday that she might have gotten a little carried away with the lobster theme. Over the next 2 weeks, Jake's house transformed again, but this time in the direction he actually wanted. The cat collection went from 68 pieces to 12 carefully chosen favorites, displayed on one elegant shelf instead of covering 3 walls. The kitchen kept its 3 best vintage appliances and got rid of the rest. The bathroom lobster ballet was reduced to a single beautiful mural on the accent wall. But the biggest change was in how Jake and Lisa communicated. Lisa started asking specific yes or no questions instead of trying to read between lines that didn't exist. Jake started finishing his sentences and saying exactly what he meant. This is so much easier, Lisa said one afternoon as they decided on paint colors. Instead of guessing what you want, I can just ask. And instead of hoping you'll figure out what I mean, I can just tell you, Jake replied. Amy, who had been supervising the whole process, was impressed. You'd have figured out something that most people never learn. How to actually communicate clearly. 3 months later, Jake's house was featured in the local newspaper under the headline From Miscommunication to Magic, a renovation success story. The article talked about how a major misunderstanding had accidentally led to some creative solutions and how learning to communicate clearly had turned a disaster into a dream home. The reporter especially loved the story of the Napoleon cat, which now sat in a place of honor on Jake's mantelpiece. He's like a little general overseeing the whole house, Jake explained in the interview. He reminds me that sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected places. Lisa framed the newspaper article and hung it in her office, right next to a photo of Jake making heart-shaped waffles in his restored vintage kitchen. She'd learned to ask, what exactly do you mean by that? Before picking up her measuring tape, and her clients appreciated the clearer communication. Jake kept the article too, along with a small Einstein cat that Lisa had given him as a thank you gift. Every morning when he made toast in his vintage toaster, he'd look at the single wall of artistic lobsters and smile. They no longer gave him nightmares. Instead, they reminded him of an important lesson about speaking clearly and listening carefully. His house had become exactly what he wanted, a comfortable home that honored his grandmother's memory without being overwhelmed by her collections. The 12 remaining cats added personality without taking over the room. The vintage appliances that he kept were the ones he actually used and enjoyed. And the lobster mural had become his favorite feature of the house, a beautiful piece of art that always made visitors smile. Mrs. Chen still came over for coffee and heart-shaped waffles every Sunday morning. She'd become friends with Lisa and often brought her own ideas for small home improvements. She said one Sunday, admiring the Einstein cat on Jake's kitchen counter. This whole experience taught you something valuable. What's that? Jake asked, flipping a waffle in the perfectly restored vintage iron. That's sometimes when you think someone isn't listening to you, they're actually listening too hard. They're hearing things you didn't even know you were saying. Jake looked around his transformed house, at the carefully chosen cats, the beloved vintage appliances, and the single wall of graceful dancing lobsters. It wasn't the house he'd planned, but it was better than anything he could have imagined. Sometimes the best things in life really do come from the most unexpected misunderstandings. You just have to be willing to figure out what you actually want. Jake knew he needed backup. This situation had gotten completely out of control, and he couldn't handle it alone anymore. So he called the one person who had always been able to translate his confusing way of talking into normal human language. His sister Amy. Amy arrived Saturday morning with a large coffee and a determined expression. She'd been dealing with Jake's communication problems their whole lives. She was the one who'd explained to their mother that when 8-year-old Jake said, "Stop making my lunch so healthy," he didn't want elaborate organic meals that took 2 hours to prepare. She was the one who told Jake's college roommate that stop being so neat didn't mean he wanted the guy to leave dirty dishes everywhere. "Show me the damage," Amy said, setting down her coffee and rolling up her sleeves. Jake gave her the full tour. They started in the living room, where 68 ceramic cats watched them from custom-lit display cases. Amy studied the Napoleon cat with the same serious expression she used in her job as a project manager. "This is actually kind of amazing," she said, examining the tiny military uniform. "But this isn't what you wanted, is it?" "Not even close," Jake said miserably. They moved to the kitchen, where vintage appliances gleamed like museum pieces. Amy tested the heart-shaped waffle iron and laughed when it produced a perfect golden waffle. "Okay, this is pretty cool," she admitted. "But again, not what you asked for." The bathroom was where Amy finally understood the full scope of a disaster. She stood in the doorway, staring at the life-size ballet-dancing lobsters, her mouth hanging open. "Jake," she said slowly, "what exactly did you tell Lisa about these lobsters?" "I said stop with the dancing lobsters," Jake said. Amy nodded grimly, and she heard make them dance better. Apparently, Amy studied the ceiling lobster, which was wearing a tiny crown and holding a conductor's baton. "You know what your problem is. You never finish your sentences. You say stop with the cats instead of remove all the cats. You say stop with the dancing lobsters instead of paint over this wallpaper with plain white paint." Jake realized his sister was right. His whole life, he'd been speaking in half-thoughts and expecting people to figure out the rest. Most people just got confused and asked for clarification. But Lisa was someone who filled in the blanks herself, and she was very good at it, just completely wrong about what the blanks should say. "We need a plan," Amy said. "You're going to call Lisa and ask her to come over Monday morning. You're going to write down exactly what you want to say beforehand. And I'm going to be here to translate if things go wrong, Sunday night." Jake and Amy sat at his kitchen table, writing out what he wanted to say. It felt like preparing for the most important presentation of his life. "Start with something positive," Amy suggested. "Tell her the work is high quality, because it is. It's just not what you wanted." Jake wrote, "Lisa, your work is beautiful and professional." "Now tell her the problem," Amy said. "Be specific. Use exact words," Jake wrote. "But there has been a misunderstanding. When I say stop, I mean remove or get rid of. I do not mean improve or make more elaborate." They practiced the conversation until Jake could say the words without getting confused or trailing off mid-sentence. Monday morning arrived gray and rainy. Lisa showed up right on time, carrying fabric samples and looking excited. "I have the most wonderful ideas for window treatments," she said, spreading cat-themed curtain samples across the coffee table. "I'm thinking we coordinate with the feline collection. Maybe some subtle paw print patterns, or," Lisa, Jake interrupted, reading from his notes. "We need to stop and talk." Something in his voice made Lisa look up from the fabric samples. For the first time since this whole thing started, she really looked at Jake instead of just hearing what she expected to hear. "The work you've done is beautiful and professional," Jake continued, sticking to his script. "But there has been a major misunderstanding. Lisa sat down slowly. The fabric sample is forgotten. What kind of misunderstanding? Amy leaned forward. Lisa, when Jake says stop, what do you think he means? Well, Lisa said carefully, usually when clients say stop, they don't really mean stop. They mean they're overwhelmed and need me to help them figure out what they actually want. My last client, Mr. Peterson, used to say stop all the time, but he really meant help me make this better. Jake and Amy exchanged glances. This explained everything, Lisa, Amy said gently. Jake is not Mr. Peterson. When Jake says stop, he means stop, full stop, and no more. Remove what's already there. Lisa's face went through several expressions: confusion, realization, and finally, complete horror. Oh no, she whispered, looking round the living room at the cat display. You actually wanted me to get rid of the cats? Yes, Jake said, perhaps a little too loudly. And the vintage appliances? Yes. And the lobster wallpaper, especially the lobster wallpaper. Lisa sank deeper into her chair, accidentally knocking over a small cat dressed as George Washington. But you always sounded so uncertain when you talked. Your voice would trail off, like you weren't sure what you wanted. I thought I was helping by reading between the lines. Amy picked up the George Washington cat and studied its tiny powdered wig. The thing is, Lisa, Jake doesn't have lines to read between. He just has scattered thoughts that sometimes connect if you're lucky. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, surrounded by the evidence of the most expensive miscommunication in home renovation history. Lisa looked around the room again, seeing it with new eyes. I turned your house into a theme park, she said quietly. A very well done theme park, Jake said, trying to be fair. But still a theme park. Still a theme park. Lisa started to laugh. Not the polite laughter of someone trying to be professional, but real. Deep laughter that shook her whole body. I can't believe this, she said between giggles. I spent 3 weeks turning your house into the Museum of Cats, vintage appliances, and dancing lobsters because I thought that's what you wanted. Jake found himself starting to smile. When Lisa put it like that, it did sound pretty ridiculous. The Napoleon cat is kind of growing on me, he admitted. Amy picked up the Einstein cat with its wild white fur and tiny chalkboard. And this one is actually pretty clever. Lisa wiped tears from her eyes. What do we do now? I mean, I can undo some of this, but the mural took Rachel a week to paint, and the display cases are built into the wall. Jake looked around his transformed house. The cats did look impressive in their custom lighting. The vintage appliances worked better than any modern equipment he'd ever owned. And the lobster mural, while terrifying, was genuinely artistic, maybe. Jake said slowly, we don't undo everything. Maybe we just figure out what I actually want to keep.